Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Mondays. Welcome to this NED Community Dynamic Boards meetup. I'm Sarah and I'm hosting the session today. I'm the CEO of Dynamic Boards. Our topic for today is CEO succession when things go wrong, negotiating good endings, finding the next CEO, setting up the relationship for success. We have a great speaker here today, Eleanor Southwood. So Ellie is an experienced NED and board member whose governance expertise spans the social and housing sectors. She's a former chair of the RNIB, the Royal National Institute for Blind People, where she led the organisation as it was going through a statutory review by the Charity Commission, a financial transformation and significant modernisation. She was a NED at Paradigm Housing Group, and she currently chairs Habinteg Housing Association, which specialises in accessible and adaptable homes across England. I've known Ellie for a few years and I've actually recorded another YouTube video with her, hearing a lot about that experience and what she went through with the RNIB. You know, she has so much board experience for us to learn from. Ellie, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Go for it.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and big thanks to Sarah and the team. I think Dynamic Boards is really helping to shift the narrative on who is allowed or who should be accessing board opportunities, but also how we all reach out for support once we get onto boards, which I guess is where I wanted to start with a few comments today. So we hear a lot, don't we, about, you know, every time that we advertise for a new chief executive, we talk about how important the chair chief executive role in particular is. And to probably slightly less extent, but certainly important, actually is the relationship between any board member and the chief executive and director team. And when it's going well, we barely notice it. So when it's going well, we feel inspired by the work of the organisations that we're serving in terms of governance. We have a good bit of back and forth and constructive challenge, and it's all working well. I wanted to, I suppose, help us to think a bit today about when things are not going well. And I suppose the crux of things going badly or needing to change in an organisation is when either the chair and chief executive relationship breaks down, or your chief executive leaves suddenly, or where you are in the position of needing to part company with a chief executive. The way I thought about the topic for today was in a couple of ways. I've tried to think up a couple of themes because I've been in all of the above positions and they're all tricky for different reasons. So I was thinking about what my main kind of learnings were. And I think the first thing that I've really learned in handling arrival of a new chief executive, departure of an existing chief executive, sometimes quite quickly and as a surprise to the wider organisation, and also starting to think about recruiting chief executives and interims as well. Being a chair with an interim chief executive is also quite an interesting dynamic, which I'll talk about too. So the first thing is I really learned that the small things matter. It's not something that we as NEDs want to think about. We want to think about how we go from good to great, how we build fantastic board exec relationships. And so there's a real risk that if something does go wrong, it really, really takes you by surprise. And of course, it's a very human thing too. So often, you know, if you need to part company with a chief executive, it's a very emotional thing to do. You might have recruited them. So you might be thinking, oh God, what's everybody looking at in terms of my and the board's judgment about this appointment in the first place? You might be thinking, oh my goodness, I knew this wasn't right and I wish I'd made a different decision or held out or, challenged board colleagues harder because I had an instinctive sense this wasn't right. So there's a whole heap of things that are going on in that moment. And the challenge is that if you're processing them while you're supporting board colleagues, director team and an organisation to process them, I think that gets really hard. I made what I consider to be, I think, the biggest kind of mistake in my career, probably, in the way that I handled one such situation, because it was a surprise. It happened really quickly. And I walked away from it feeling like I hadn't treated the other person with the respect and dignity that they deserved. And it came down to a couple of really practical, silly things, like finding an adequate, quiet, private space to have the conversation. And I know it sounds obvious, but it was one of those that, conversation wasn't really even on the cards, and then within an hour it was. And so finding the right space, I didn't take enough time to set the conversation up well. I didn't take a moment to process my own feelings about it before I went into that conversation. And so I didn't set us up for what was inevitably going to be a difficult conversation, but I didn't set us up well. That is something in my career, when I look back, it's one of those I sort of cringe and think, well, I've got to learn from that. And whilst I haven't been in an exactly similar position, it's something I really think about, is always being prepared. Because when and if it happens, it's you as chair who will need to deal with it and then support other people to process it. And you have to have dealt, with your own sort of feelings and misgivings before you're able to do that. So that was quite a hard lesson to learn. The second reflection I had is it's just never too early to start thinking about these things. So I think one chief executive who I recruited, I think I have to be a bit careful with language, of course, because it's a board decision. It's not a chair's prerogative in terms of recruitment. But the reality is, as chair, you have a large footprint in that decision and a large responsibility. And I think the first time that I asked a new chief exec coming into post how long they thought they might stay there, I think both of us sort of thought, God, that was a bit of a strange question. But I've never regretted it, because it opened up a conversation about what sort of role they thought it was. Was it a transformation 2-year stint? Was it a final role at the end of a fabulously successful career that would see them into retirement? That all of those things are very different in terms of how the chief exec approaches the job and how we as NEDs approach our relationship with them. So it's definitely never too early to start. And that particularly helps when we're thinking about succession, because really it's one of those, and in fact most of what we're talking about today, sometimes they're the things you just can't talk to any of your board colleagues about because they might not know, or it might be harder to find your kind of safe space for conversation. The only person who knows the organisation better than a chair is the chief exec, probably, and often people on the director team too. But in terms of long-term strategy, in terms of what sort of leadership is right for the organisation. So being able to talk openly to your chief exec about what might come next has just been such a gift to me in those roles. Helping, and of course they don't have part in the decision-making process, but a trusted advisor, absolutely, as long as nothing's kind of gone wrong in the relationship. I mentioned interims, and that can be a particularly tricky dynamic, I suppose, because often an interim might have come from the ranks of the director team. So one of the main things that a chair is supporting the interim with is no longer being a peer amongst their director colleagues. And many of us in the room will have been in that position in our day jobs too, is suddenly you're not a peer, you are somebody's boss. And that can be quite a hard thing. Offering support to an interim chief exec in that way can be really valuable. But also, of course, the looming, no one's an interim forever. So from the very moment you appoint an interim, you've got some sort of process looming on the horizon in which they may or may not participate and in which they may or may not be successful. So I've been in this situation a couple of times, and again, openness has been really helpful. Making sure they don't find out things about the process from anybody except you is something that I know the interims I've worked with have really appreciated. And making sure that your relationship is kind of stable enough that they can raise any concerns with you along the way is really important. But of course, it's also true that they may not end up being the long-term chief executive. It is also true that however careful you are about managing a recruitment process, inevitably it destabilises a bit the director team and the organisation. And depending on its size, that can be significant. So there may also be people on your director team who feel they can no longer confide in or work with the interim, or that, somehow that relationship isn't quite right. So one of the things that I've found quite useful to do is to speak individually to each of the directors. Firstly, to make clear that just because one of them is in the running for the permanent job, they are all welcome to apply. But equally, they shouldn't feel the need to apply just to prove their commitment to the organisation, because I think we've all been in those situations too, where we've kind of felt obliged to apply for something. But more importantly than either of those things is to open up that channel of communication such that during the process, you do have a line to the director team that doesn't involve the interim chief exec. And that's quite a tricky thing for a chair-chief exec relationship to bear, because the whole point of the chair-chief exec relationship is a kind of exclusive relationship, right? There are things that you talk to your chief execs about that you wouldn't talk to the wider director team. And no chair wants to inadvertently undermine their chief executive by talking too much to individual directors. So it is a challenging balance to strike, but in those moments, it has felt really useful to do that. And the final sort of reflection that I thought I'd share to start us off is people are watching. So I think sometimes, particularly when we get embroiled in recruitment processes and thinking about what skills and experience do we need, it's easy to get kind of sucked into the process, if you like. And taking the time to stand back a bit is really important, because the thing that you can sometimes lose sight of is that, people are watching chairs and chief execs all the time, actually. And one of the most powerful ways to model good governance is how you behave towards each other and in public when you're going through something tricky like a recruitment process. Because if the chair and chief exec are modelling a really constructive, disagreeing well, all of those good things that we love, but if you can model that at a tricky time for an organisation, I think it is really palpable how much confidence that gives the organisation that things are going to be okay. Because everyone in an organisation has their own level of angst about, when there's change at the top, everybody does. And so there's a big responsibility for the chair to sort of step up and model how you would like people to be feeling at that moment. And I learnt this a hard way as well, that there are always in organisations people who, well, we all have, everybody has an agenda, but there are people who might look for a tiny gap between chair and chief executive that is exploitable for, a bit of underhand briefing, a bit of politicking. And I did learn the hard way that it only takes a tiny difference. And once people get wind of a difference between you, I think that's really hard to come back from. So we don't agree all the time, of course, that's not the point of the relationship, but it absolutely has to be a sort of united one. And sometimes, because people are watching, what that might mean is that sometimes it's like a theatre of disagreement. So sometimes we all disagree with our chief execs in private, and that's fine. But actually, sometimes it's good to rehearse that a little bit more publicly with the board to demonstrate and give people confidence that, there is disagreement going on. Here's how we handle it. And actually that's what we're all engaged in. So it's back to that kind of modelling the relationship point. But it's even more important to do it at those moments of instability in organisations, and even more important to do it when colleagues around you may not all be entirely perhaps supportive of one or other of you, or indeed both of you. So Sarah, I'll probably leave it there for now, but those were the key reflections that I sort of on thinking about this, was thinking about, I've been in these positions for about just over a decade now. So some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I really appreciate you spending the time giving us that talk. And I'm sure many of you have started thinking in the context of the boards that you are on and how you have seen that relationship being managed. So I'm just going to share my screen in a moment and we'll have a think about some of these questions for ourselves. What early warning signs suggest that the CEO board relationship is beginning to break down? And how can a board kind of respond before it becomes a crisis? What fosters that open communication between the board and CEO? And what can you do if you don't have that? Is the board-CEO relationship a good role model to others in the organisation? I think that how can we disagree well is a really good challenge, Ellie. And CEO succession. Is it a tick box exercise or a strategic and comprehensive process? We'll take a few moments now just in silence, just have a think about those questions, and then we'll go into breakout rooms.